Welcome, everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome at today's podcast episode Mr. Gabriel Hopkins at Ripjar. Hi, Gabriel. Thanks for
Hey,
joining us for today's session.
nice to chat to you.
Great. So let's start right away. I've got the first question for you, which is if you could tell us a bit more about your journey as a product leader, what brought you to this field? What are you busy with these days?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've been doing something that resembles product management for at least 25 years. And during that time, it's been referred to as different things, but ultimately, I think it is product management. I started my career as a graphic designer and as a front-end developer. And then I quickly realized that although I enjoyed that stuff, where my real skill lay and where my, I worked for a company called Earthboard at the time, and I was the guy that they would send up to visit some customer who, had some ideas about what they wanted in our product, and I'd get to go and have that conversation, and I could talk to the business people and understand their needs, and then talk to the technical people and try and bridge that. And over time, I got called a proposition manager at one point, and but eventually it sort of settled down. So I've spent time in that sort of fintech sector with Earthport. Then I went to RBS actually, and I worked on a number of different products at RBS, Royal Bank of Scotland. And most of the time I was there, I worked for what was called RBS WorldPay at the time. It's now called WorldPay. And that was a really interesting journey. So e-commerce products, fraud management, all of that side of things. And I was there when RBS were forced to sell that business. I spent a bit of time doing private equity, which is also, has a different complexion to it. And then I joined a company called Adeptra that quickly got bought by another company called FICO. And FICO is actually a giant in a lot of different areas, not always that well known, but they are involved with a product called Falcon. We're screening about 2/3 of the world's credit and debit card transactions. So I was lucky enough to work on that product. I was there for a number of years, and then 3 years ago I joined Ripjar, where I'm now the chief product officer. And just to give you a super quick overview of Rip, we've got two really cool products actually. One which is in that sort of bank financial services space, which is really working on customer screening and what's called counterparty screening. So let's say you're a bank and you're bringing on new customers or new vendors or new businesses. You want to check to make sure what's the risk associated with these new customers. And we help those banks screen against things like sanctions, PEPs, and risk that's raised in the media, what's called adverse media. And we do that both when they bring on their customers and also through the lifetime of that customer. And we've got a number of really good innovations there. Our background is actually in national security. The founders all came from what's called GCHQ in the UK, so the Signals Intelligence Service of the government. And that's a clue to the other side of the business, which we call Labyrinth Intelligence. And it's a set of data fusion capabilities in a platform that's used to do all sorts of interesting things, and it's used by quite a few cybersecurity companies. I think people think that Ripjar is a cybersecurity company, and that's sort of half true. But what we really do is produce this platform that's used by cybersecurity companies in order to understand what are the risks associated with a potential compromise or with an actual compromise that's happened, bringing together data from sometimes hundreds of different sources to understand that. And that same capability is used in national security and policing and the military in different countries in order to pull data together. So that's a pretty cool area to be working in. And it's nice to, be part of something where you're actually catching some proper bad guys as well as part of the process. So yeah, quite a lot to think about across the board there.
Interesting experience from graphic designer, from developer to a chief product officer at such companies as Ripjar. Nice. So how many years you've been in, let's say, this product side already?
Yeah, at least 20, I think. So I joined RBS in 2003, and I think that was the first time I had a job title that was actually sort of product manager. But really, I'd been doing that kind of work prior to that, if that makes sense.
Right.
So, yeah, graphic designer, great job. Wouldn't want to knock it, but you do have to spend a lot of time making a lot of people happy who will think things should be the color that they like. I'm not sure product manager is probably some of the same compromises, isn't it? Just from a slightly different perspective. But yeah, I think it's interesting when you think about product management, unless you're, working in a very different area to the one that we all work in, really you're dealing with software. And so I think having, you do tend to see two types of product managers, ones who've got that software background, ones that haven't. Not that, as product managers, we should be writing code or even telling people how to write code, but just that ability to have some of those conversations with those people, I think is really interesting. So I'm very glad I've got that experience in my career.
Great. All right. That's thank you for sharing your journey. It's great progress and great experience of what you mentioned. So we brought you today to this episode to discuss aligning teams. So could you explain to us what that means from your perspective as a product manager and how teams are aligned in your current company, Ripjar?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, actually. The more I thought about it, the more different kind of permutations I put on it. So let me sort of just break down some of that thought process. I think whenever you think about the work that a product manager does, it's probably not a good idea to think about that as an independent, separate thing. Product managers exist in this world in order to create the bonds within organizations, and so I think it's just as important to make sure that the staff that you have that have a product manager title understand how they align with each other and how they align with the organization, as it is to make sure that the wider organization, particularly when you're looking at this from a sort of chief product officer point of view, that the wider organization has that view on what your products are, where they're going, and that alignment. And I think that sort of sounds simple, but that's a lifetime's work actually in most organizations, is making sure that you have that good alignment, that you continue to evolve it and react to situations as they arise. And I'm certainly not trying to suggest that I do this perfectly, but it's good to, I think, measure yourself and to think about how am I actually doing getting this message out on an ongoing basis. From a very pure mechanical point of view, we have two products. I just told you about them. Great, exciting products. We have two product managers, one that looks after one that looks after the other. So we've got that sort of span of control there. And then we actually have another product manager that looks after what we call platform, which is a lot of the features that feed those two products. I won't go into, oodles of detail on that, but we find that's a good match. And I think what I would say when it comes down to this, how do you take the people in your organization and make them work effectively from a product point of view, is it's very important to have clear span of control. And I also think for my organizations, it's very important that the product manager is end to end. Let me sort of get into that. I know this is somewhat controversial in some areas, but I see a lot of organizations that have product managers and technical product managers. And the product managers are the guys that see the customers, and they go and come up with all the big ideas and have the meetings and do whiteboard sessions. I'm characterizing here, but you get the idea, stereotyping. And then the technical product managers are the guys that work sometimes in the development teams, and they write up the stories and they feed the stories to the developers and they answer questions. And if the developer asks the question, they channel it through up the stream, and the other product manager will sort of help them answer it. I think that's a disaster, quite frankly. I think it's doomed to failure because you end up with two people both responsible for the same thing with very different outlooks on life, and you're getting the worst of all worlds. And you see in those organizations, often you're tackling a lot of tech debt, and of course you need to tackle the tech debt, but you're not really addressing the customer issues at the same time. and often the balance is more of a reflection of the power of the CTO versus the chief product officer versus anything else that is logical or makes sense. My thinking on this is that it's important to have product managers that can stretch all the way through. That doesn't mean they need to be technical experts, but that they have enough capability to be able to write stories and to work closely with the engineers. The same person is speaking to the partner or the customer, hearing, in the market what's going on, understanding that market context, and then is delivering stories which are delivered out through the technology people and is reviewing those stories. And that means that you have to look for, quite a narrow skill set, and those people are difficult to find, but I think it's really, really worth the investment. Then you can slice it in a number of different ways. So a common question is, well, I've got one product or two products, and I've got 4 product managers. What am I going to do? And I do think that it's okay to have people who are a bit more technical and a bit less technical as product managers in the same area. What I would always do is just try to reserve or maintain that span of control. And it can be more difficult if you have, an outnumbered set of product managers to products, but then you should divide the product up so that this one person has a clear view across this whole space, or you can put people in supporting roles. So one major product manager with someone else who is their sort of deputy to do that. But the key ingredient is that you don't end up with that. You don't want more links in the chain if you can possibly avoid it. So that's sort of, I think the practical side of setting up the teams. From an alignment point of view, I think the thing that probably most product managers don't do enough of is get in on a Monday morning and think, do my salespeople, do my graphic designers, do the rest of the SLT, with all of their different roles and responsibilities, understand enough about why we're doing what we're doing as an organization, and what can we do to make sure that's better? What are the artifacts that we need to produce to do that? I know that's almost impossible to do. I find it almost possible to do with the workload that comes from having happy customers who want new features and all of those good things. But I think that's a really critical element to a happy, successful product organization.
Okay. Well, let me ask you one more follow-up question on that. You touched on like technical versus non-technical product managers. That got me interested. Like when I think about product managers, or when we like building kind of some marketing materials that should be appealing to product managers, we kind of think about them rather being non-technical, as we think it kind of prevails in this kind of product manager space. But so you're saying that having like a technical product manager and then product manager who's like kind of like from a business side, it's not really a good idea. So, and then you also mentioned that looking for such people is quite difficult, because being like technical and kind of understanding and being able to understand what your clients want and so on. This is something that probably is very difficult for a lot of companies. So how do you search for such talents? How do you find people that kind of match this kind of profile?
Yeah, and it can be even more daunting in certain jurisdictions, I've found. So in the US, I think you get a lot of people who would give themselves the product marketing title, who are very much those business-facing product managers. They can turn up at a show and do a great presentation, and people love the presentation. But when it comes to what's on the backlog, they haven't got a clue. They point you somewhere else. I think it's really challenging to go get them. All I'd say is do endeavor. 2 years ago was an almost impossible recruitment market. Right now it's a lot better. So I would just wait. And I think from my experience, we have been able to hire some real megastars in that space who can do that balance. And I just think, if you're going to side one way or the other, then deep technical knowledge is not important. It's more about, is this person confident to sit with an engineer and to work stuff through with them? Do they have enough wherewithal to do that? They may have to ask lots of, this is a dumb question, but type questions. That's fine. But I think in the situation where you have, when we're sort of going back to waterfall, and you have some guy who's really a marketing person saying, I think the product should do X, and sending that down the line and waiting to hear what comes, waiting to see what comes back. 9 times out of 10, you're reworking the hell out of that thing. That's been my experience. I'm sure some people have got it to work. And so you're either doubling up anyway, or you're getting poor results. So I would just keep that sort of structure, in mind, and try and work towards that. You may have an organization that's transitioning and you can take steps, but as soon as the person who's writing the requirements doesn't feel that intimate ownership for the result of what they write, then the pact is broken, isn't it, on that? And you're going to get some finger pointing, and you're going to get those types of behaviors coming out.
I agree. Okay, interesting. Thank you. Well, my next question follows up on one of our previous conversations when you mentioned that you'd like to dispel the myth that the product manager's point of view should always prevail. I found that interesting. So can you maybe elaborate on that statement?
Yeah, it's probably not a popular opinion for some people, but I think there was a lot of talk 5 years ago, maybe more recently, about the fact that the product manager is a mini CEO, was the sort of terminology that was used. That there's someone who's ideally placed to make product level decisions. That's what the clues in the title. That's their name, and to decide what should go where and when. And I just think that sets a really bad organizational precedent. It's very unempowering for other people in the team. I know that there's a number of schools of thought where organizations have literally insulated the product and the engineering functions from the rest of the business so that they can go and do their mission and go and build their software. And it kind of is the same concept as talking about the technical manager and technical product manager and business product manager, which is, I think, as soon as you're out of that context, you're not going to build great software. And when I think about, what we're trying to do in these organizations, which is to build the best possible product for the customer that the customers like and that they're delighted by, that doesn't happen by somebody, however intelligent they are, sitting in a room and dreaming it up by themselves. So what I mean by this, and I'll be very clear, I don't think you should ever also go to the other extreme and build software just because one customer wants it. But I think that actually what you can do here as a good product manager is be the synthesis between all of the different inputs. So, what are you going to have in most firms? You're going to have an SLT that has a number of different agenda items, things that they want to do for whatever reason, whether it's an operational saving, whether or not it's a technical bit of, upgrade some software. And then you're going to try and drive innovation. And innovation, good innovation, I'm sure it does come from product managers sitting, in coffee bars thinking about things deeply. But quite often it comes from something that you hear from a customer, or something your CEO hears from a customer. And so for my money, the important thing is to make sure that the product managers are a trusted part of the organization. They're not seen as being in an ivory tower. And so, I mean, it comes back to your last question. It can be hard to find these guys and girls out there in the market, but you want someone who the salespeople are comfortable with and the customers are comfortable with. In my organizations, I expect the product managers to be speaking to customers at least once a week in some form, often much more commonly than that. And then And then it's about looking at the market and seeing what others are doing to some extent, so that you're not get caught unawares, and thinking about what are the factors that I'm actually hearing from customers. So, customers won't tell you what to build, and you should be very, very wary if they try to do that. But they're talking to you because there's something they need that's not working. So to be able to go and have those conversations, to hear what's the gap here, and to be able to think with the technical authority in your organization about how to address that. That's the job of a product manager, not to sit in an ivory tower and dream stuff up. Now, of course, you need to make sure that you're protecting a good amount of your resources into doing innovation, which is maybe slightly more left field, and that's always a challenge. But those ideas, if you just think those ideas are going to come from one guy, it won't work, right? Because they won't. And so I think it's much better to be open to the voices that are out there. And very often some of the best things that we've done have come from data scientists or people in the organization. Often people who have some contact with customers, so they're hearing that stuff, very bright guys. What an absolute waste not to use that. And so that's why I think it's not a democracy for sure. At some point you've got a very, very rare set of resources that you need to use in an effective way, but listening to those voices is really important.
I agree that that's a great attitude too. Well, if you're listening from all over your organization, interesting ideas can come from any end, right? And that takes us to my next question. If there's I assume quite often there's like something that the customer wants, and you take it through your processes and agree, okay, this is the next feature we need to add, and this is how it's going to look like. And then it comes to the technical team, and if they have a different outlook, if there's like conflict of interests between your team and the technical team, or like how do you align these? Like, can you give maybe some specific example on how you handle the situation when there was a conflict of interests within different teams?
Yeah, just trying to come up with a crisp example here. I mean, the first thing I would say is, if you have a situation where your customers are coming to you with a very specific requirement and expecting that to be done in a certain amount of time, you are in a professional services organization, and that may or may not work for you, but it's not necessarily great for all sorts of other factors around the business. We deal with some very large customers, and large customers by their very nature are very used to getting the stuff done and delivered on time. So I continue to spend a lot of time building trust with those customers, doing roadmap sessions with those customers. People buy products because they want the continuous improvement that comes with products. People buy bespoke software because they want exactly what they want on their time frame, or they think that's what they're going to get. And so I think it's always it's answering a slightly different question, but make sure that you invest that time with customers. We'll see customers at least once a quarter, each customer, to make sure that you're reviewing what you're doing and why, so they can understand why, in order to do it. Now, I don't live in a fairy tale. You still have customers who want something immediately, and I think the worst scenario is actually, I've been told by X person 3 months ago this was going to be in a release a month ago. So you're not just struggling to meet a time expectation in the future. You're struggling to meet a time expectation in the past. So in the scenario that you talk about, it's not actually something that I've had that much, because we will spend time with the customer when we're capturing the requirement, sort of end to end, to make sure it works. I guess what I would say is, there's a role there for a good solution architect. We're very lucky. We have a good team of solution architects here who are involved with the customer at that point in time to understand what is the thing you need. Ideally, how can we deliver that with an existing bit of functionality that requires zero change in the organization. But if that's not the case, how can we deliver that in a way that's valuable for all of the customers, and to take that through? But just to take the question to its sort of nth degree, I think in the same way that often you see technical product managers who don't, exist below the surface and don't come up for air, I don't think that your engineers should never be exposed to customers. I think this is a fantastic thing to do, actually, at the right time. Same with your UX team, is they love seeing customers. They love going through these things. And I think you can really re-baseline a conversation. If the sales guy tells the customer no, then all they hear is this is a money thing or whatever it might be. But if you say, okay, we understand what you want, we've got some questions, I'm going to bring in this expert who builds our software, I'm going to spend some time. Clearly you need to work with your head of engineering to do that. Those can be some of the best sessions you have across the board with the customer. So I think as a leadership team, you need to have a clear view about how you're going to do that, so it doesn't get abused. But I would really embrace that, and I think most customers I've ever dealt with, when taken through something from that logical perspective, they'll accept it and they'll be understanding. Okay, maybe the thing that we wanted isn't quite right, but we're going to do it this way. So this is a line of thinking that comes from a guy called Rich Mironoff. I don't know if you've heard of him, and I think it's great. It actually was a bit of a wake-up call for me when I heard it. It is not the product manager's job to protect the organization, and often you can do it and it will cause more harm than if you just asked for some help and got some of those resources to come in, and you can generate a lot of delight that way, one way or another. You obviously got to be selective about it. Those people have got jobs to do, and disrupting them is expensive. But I would do that. And I think overall, just in an organization, to come up with some of these alignment questions, I would just tell anybody on an SLT here, don't fall for the squeaky wheel. All right, so you've got customer A making a huge amount of noise about something they want. You've got customer B keeping silent. You need to evaluate what are the actual important things to keep these customers happy, and what's fake here. And often, it's very tempting to go and do the thing that is creating a lot of noise. But when you break it down and you actually look at the impact and the workarounds and those things, they're not there. And nothing is more precious in a software development company than software development. And so finding ways to strip out, expensive, unnecessary things is so valuable. We've had situations where we've literally flipped functionality backwards and forwards more than once, because customer A wanted it one way, customer B wanted another way, and the customer A, so that sort of coordination as well, I think, is important, and that maybe comes to some other points about collective memory and about software architecture, which can be very difficult to do, but I think can make sure that you're spending your dollars wisely.
So filtering the noise, that's one of the things that a good product manager needs to have. Are there any other things, any other characteristics that, in your opinion, a good modern product manager should have?
Yeah, I think probably number one is the ability to keep their cool. How many times a day do you get challenged with something which is enough to completely send you off the charts? I think the product managers we all respect are the ones who just take a breath, wait a second, let the emotion pass, and respond thoughtfully. And you need to think. Product managers are great empathizers, right? So this person is coming to me with a problem. This sales guy is talking to me about some slightly crazy feature that he thinks we should have in the product. I'm just going to explain. He's not come to me, or she's not come to me because they're stupid. They've come because they really believe what they're saying, and so you need to respect that and to have that empathy and compassion, while whilst also being certain with your response there. So I think, yeah, that ability to keep calm in situations is very, very important. The ability to slightly suppress your own ego, coming back to this idea of the mini CEOs. People are going to come up with other ideas, and very often, you just need to be willing to take a look at those and evaluate them fairly, because we're all anchored, and so I think understanding that bias and doing something about it. And yeah, of course, and this comes with time, but we've all known great product managers who just know their product, know their space, know their industry inside out, and often that does just take a lot of time. But those guys are gold dust. And then one from another product inspiration for me is a guy called Matt LeMay, who does some great stuff. And he says in his introduction to product management that you got to be willing to buy the donuts, right? If the situation requires that you go down the shop and get the donuts, if that's going to unstick your problem, then be willing to do that. Put your ego aside and facilitate the discussion. So I think that's my sort of go-to mental model is, okay, what can I do to unstick this? Because usually you don't get brought in if everything's going smoothly.
Perfect. Thank you very much for sharing that with us. I've got 5 final questions that I always ask at the end of each interview. So the first one is, what is your number 1 challenge at work?
My gut instinct is Slack, actually.
How do you mean that?
I think Slack generates these really weird, bizarre behaviors, right? It's squeaky wheel all the way through. Everyone's got their urgent thing. It's in a channel. Once they've added you on a Slack thing, it's your problem, even if you didn't see it. I do just think that there's we quite often need to make sure that we're using the right tools for the right thing. I've seen bug triage done on Slack. I think some of these things are just it's not the right place to do that, and it generates emotions and unhappiness. In doing that, I've seen Slack used as a sort of pseudo Jira, and I just think Jira, being a sort of productivity tool for the planning. I just think use the tools which are there, and that will that will work out a lot better for you. I do feel like I'm sort of trying to hark back to a Dickensian era before instant messaging, but I've been amazed at some of the pain and suffering that's been caused by that platform. I'm sure it's also helped a lot of people with their productivity as well.
But yeah, I totally agree that sometimes oftentimes it's actually better to meet face to face, right, rather than texting on Slack. It's just some things just get lost. Okay, the second of these quickies, if you could choose one key metric, the North Star, for you to define your success as a product leader, what would that be?
Yeah, I have sort of thought about this before, and I'll give you a product one in a second, because I think that's actually quite an interesting way of putting it. I think the product managers, if they're not aligned to the company, are probably not thinking the right way. So I do think, and this maybe a bit controversial, that new revenue is the key metric. That's what the company is working towards generally. Maybe if you work in a different type in the government or something else, it's slightly different, but it's certainly in a commercial company, new revenue. And I would say with a split of existing customers and new customers, I think if you are picking up extra revenue from existing customers, you have a product that is extremely valuable. If you're picking up new revenue from new customers, you have a product that's extremely valuable, and you should be very worried if either of those things don't work. It may not be it may not be entirely your responsibility, but if that is a surefire sign that your product is not working. From a product management point of view, I would say it's a lack of excess releases. I think if you find you're doing lots of releases, then it means you're your factory is not working efficiently, and those extra releases are hugely expensive from a productivity, morale, every point of view, frankly. And so it's one thing that we look to do as an organization, is to try and stamp on extra patch releases and extra releases beyond the ambition that we set ourselves.
Great. Yeah, I just wanted to ask one more question on that, but yeah, I just forgot it. No worries. So let's go to the next one. How do you collect feedback from your customers? What processes and tools do you use for that?
Yeah, we're very fortunate in one way, which is most of our go-to-market is with a small number, tens of big customers. So we're able to meet with them, as mentioned before, at least once a quarter. Often we'll have, from a product management point of view, there'll certainly be interactions with those customers several times a week across the organization. And so we've built a good level of trust there. We share the roadmaps, we get feedback there, and I think you could always do more on that. I think the other thing, which is not quite right for us right now because of our size, is I think that you can get, in previous jobs, user forums have been really great. You get up, but they've got to be done face to face. The virtual ones are just honestly a bit of a waste of energy. I think the face to face user forums, where you can have your users talking about their successes and failures with the product in a sort of no blame scenario, are just a fantastic way to get that feedback. And the best possible scenario is customer A hears customer B talking about things that they do, and they expand what they do, and they like it, right? And it delivers them value. So yeah, a few different things there. I would say nothing beats going and seeing the customer face to face, and we're fortunate to do it. But if you're in a bigger organization, or organization with lots of smaller customers, you probably want to do user forums, or even go more user surveys down the smaller customers.
Actually, I just like the previous question I had. You talked about upselling your current clients. If that works, then you're doing the right job, right? Like, you're introducing new functionalities, new features that your current customers appreciate. They're willing to pay extra for these. I think HubSpot is doing a really great job in that. They sometimes acquire a new company, and then they kind of integrate them into the product offering, and then it's a very interesting feature, and a lot of their customers are willing to pay for that. So do you is this a focus at Ripjar? Do you somehow track how did the customer started, and if they're do you have some kind of modules in your product they can add later on, and how does that work?
To some extent, and we're building more stuff out. We're actually fortunate that what we see, and it's a little different to some of the rest of the RegTech or FinTech world, is that we'll have customers, and they'll buy and they'll deploy, and I'm going to make this up, right? Because I don't want to sort of label customers. They'll deploy in France, and then they'll say, okay, well, now we're going to deploy in Germany, and then they'll roll it out to 15, 20 customers. So that's, that's great, right? That's, the software's working, I have credibility in it, and it becomes a critical part of their infrastructure. And so, that's good from a number of different metrics. But yeah, in our case, there are some module upsells, but it's more about finding new areas of the business, or new things that different areas of the business can do. And so that's why the engagement directly with the customer to understand their business and to go through their challenges is particularly important. But yeah, and I've seen others do it well, where it's upsell this. I think the pricing dynamics interesting there. If you're buying something that costs $50 a month, and you add another $5 a month to the service from a cost point of view, that's all cool. People can get that signed off. We're tending to be in the higher sort of area there from a cost point of view. It's a big, it's a big platform used in different ways, and so you do want to avoid people thinking, oh my God, do I really have to pay more money to fully use this product? So I think it's a careful balance between those considerations. You don't want the customers feeling like they've been nickel and dimed. Get to the checkout and you've got to pay more than you expected for some reason. This is not a good look it erodes trust. But yes, no, I think you can do that in a modular way. We just launched this new thing called Copilot, and that will have to be modular because it has that's the way that the cost profile works.
Okay, interesting. We went through collecting feedback rather live than those online forums. I've seen a lot of companies using these kind of like online forums, give us feedback, and like you just fill out a form online. I think this is like you don't. I mean, if you're averaging some like points that people give you, maybe it's just like it's nice that you have some number, right? But like you cannot really like this is not like a quality research in terms of what to do next.
Yeah, I think depending on the setting, it can have value. When I worked at WorldPay, we were much more of a in the SME business. It was much more of a thousands to one, type numbers, or maybe tens of thousands of customers using the platform. We added a net promoter score, which is what the Bain guys came up with here, and there was value in two ways. The first reason is no one realized there was a problem before, but it's very hard to sort of look down the barrel of you've got a net promoter score of -50 and not wanting to do something about it. So I think it can generate. By the way, I'm not quoting world current NPL. I have no idea what that is, but it's very hard to look down at that data, and you do get a lot of just verbatims. Of course, the verbatims all come from angry people. But if you're in that one-to-many type of product, some of that stuff's great, right? Some of it's just, one person had one bad experience and they're very stuck on it, just like you see on, Amazon and whatever. But we would go through, and we would, like the leader of the customer service section would look at every single comment, because that's where some of the gems came from. So I wouldn't discount that stuff entirely depending on your context, but I wouldn't do it with my customers, because they'd be like, seriously, Gabriel, why don't you just ring me up and ask me? And they would just, they'd be bent out of shape by it. But I think it can, work in some contexts. So I wouldn't discount it out of hand.
All right. Thank you for elaborating on that. I've got last two questions. Build versus buy. How do you decide?
Yeah, and I would sort of interpret this in the context of sort of component level stuff when you're building software. So and we do build a lot of our own internal components, but the key difference, there's two factors to bear in mind here, which is the thing that I'm going to do going to be significantly better than the current state of the art that's out there? So for example, we have built our own name matching software. We are a name matching company. In essence, that's what we do. We help people match stuff with their customers. And so our ability to have that and to be significantly better than the market is really great. And we can talk about it, stick it in your marketing, do all those things, of course, and we do. But it is very easy to fall in the trap. And I've been, when I was a tech folk, I did this myself, is I can write a better email client, or I can write a better thing. Of course you can't, right? I mean, there's loads of people doing it out there. You can get this stuff for free. So I think you just need to consider with each of these components, where's the state of the art? Can I beat that? And if not, don't thrash around and build something that is as good or not quite as good as the stuff that you could get for either good rates or essentially for free, and use it in the market. So I think it's very much that sort of case by case evaluation, and you want to come back and look at those decisions. We've actually done that. So 5-10 years ago, some of the components we had, there wasn't good open source things out there. Now some of those things are better, and we reevaluate them on a 6-month yearly basis as these questions come up, because the money that you're spending building that email client that everyone thinks is crap compared to what everyone else has, is money you're not spending on the stuff that can differentiate your product. So sort of basic in a way, but I think it's a good sense check on that.
And do you do these kind of evaluations, as you mentioned, every 6 months on all the components that you use, and like trying to look for better alternatives or open source projects that evolved?
I wouldn't say a diary reminder goes off when we do it, but whenever we're looking to do some work, open up a component, we'll take a look at, is this the best way of doing it?
I see.
I think you can get very anchored by, well, we've always done it this way. And so I think you just need to have a very honest lens on that.
Okay, my last question. What role do integrations with third-party products play in your product?
Yeah, on both sides of the fence, on the screening business and on the intelligence business, it's all about data and getting the data through. And so, we've always prioritized making sure that we have high quality APIs that can be used either by our internal folks to do integrations or by external people who want to use those. And I think one of the things that our CTO at the time, is now CEO, was inspired by is when 5-6 years ago, when we were building out our intelligence product, we built an abstraction layer in there. So we identified that a lot of the other vendors in our space were very tied to the data, and so bringing in extra data was extremely expensive and costly. But no, making a platform there that can be used by different customers in different ways has been the lifeblood of that part of the organization. And so, yeah, we have relationships with vendors across both. We do package those integrations up, but our philosophy has always been to enable people to bring their own data, because that can be one of the squeak spots, that if you don't have that, all of a sudden, somebody wants some data and it's on your roadmap. Now, it may make it onto the roadmap eventually, because you might want to bring it in as a sort of first-class data integration, but there's nothing better than being able to say, okay, all you need to do here is to bring this file in here or use this API, and then the customer can be empowered to do that. So I don't know if that's quite answering your question, but hopefully that's sort of some interesting thoughts in that space.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. So let me just thank you, Gabriel, for joining us for today's episode. It was a great pleasure. Thanks for it was great having you here. And yeah, best of luck going ahead with Ripjar and on your future career. And we'll be looking forward to see you back here at some point, or see you around.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. It's been really interesting to talk. So thanks.
All right. Take care. Have a nice day. Bye.
Perfect. Cool. Cheers.